läste väl lite så. Och jag kommer ihåg att vi pratade om gamla Västgötalagen. Att det var den äldsta lagen i Sverige. Men annars så var det ju slaget vid Brunkeberg och såna här saker som man pratade om lite. Så att det var Stockholms fixerat. Och Ansgar, kommer jag ihåg.
Berätta lite om Ansgar.
Ja, att han var den första kristne missionären som kom till Sverige och liksom kristnade Sverige helt enkelt. Det var vad man fick lära sig.
The official story of Sweden appearing in schoolbooks as recently as a few years ago is that the country was Christianized from Mälardalen outwards, starting from the old trading town of Birka near Stockholm by Saint Ansgar. But it's wrong. Ansgar was just a ship's priest who tended to the Christian needs of the foreign traders who lived in Birka. He left no church, no graveyard, and no local Christian converts. Still, much later this did not prevent a grand monument being erected to Ansgar on the island. Visited by hordes of foreign tourists and Swedish schoolchildren every year, the large cross commemorates an event that did not happen. Sweden was not Christianized from here, from the Stockholm area, from the east coast, or by Ansgar in the 800s, but from elsewhere, the west coast. How many tourists realize this? The west coast was part of the North Atlantic, North Sea world, and by the early 500s, that is, centuries earlier, the Christian community in England was already organized. Monks in Ireland, led by St. Patrick, took the lead in missionary work. One such mission travelled across the North Sea in about 516. They were taken and protected by a sub-tribe of the Västgöta called the Sea Geats, because they were close to the sea, just some mile up western Sweden's great river, the Göta Älv. So here's a bit of name recognition for British people. Beowulf. The researcher Peter Jarntoft reckons that the whole Beowulf myth grew out of this episode. Beowulf is the great Anglo-Saxon epic poem set in the land of the Geats. It's not hard to guess that the Geats means the same as the Västgöta people. Beowulf is the English-speaking world's most famous epic poem. Beowulf the warrior was a mythical figure, but the king mentioned in the poem Hygelac actually existed. Historian and researcher Peter Jarntoft has evidence that Hygelac's kingdom was in Vastergotland, in a place that, 1500 years ago, was a salt water and easily navigable down to the North Sea. Now it's more clearly a river area because of the land rise. The climactic scene of the poem, as every English A-level student knows, is when the dragon was cast down from the cliff. The dragon was a metaphor for the Odin-worshipping heathens who attacked this brief outpost of Christianity in Scandinavia. En route I hear stories about the Edda, the mythical folk tales of Scandinavia. Iceland officially, but the Icelanders immigrated from mainland Scandinavia. The land of the Goths, or Geats, is mentioned in these legendary tales about Odin and Thor. According to legend, Odin settled by a lake that fits the description of Vänern, which is Västergötland's big lake, one of Europe's big lakes actually. But today we're not going to do anything about the Norse gods, only Beowulf. 30 kilometres up the motorway, we turn into a small road, then an even smaller one, and find ourselves in a perfectly peaceful area. What a relief. This is Beowulf country. Within a few kilometres radius you have place names that resemble those found in the Beowulf poem. The cliff a few minutes away is called Ernest today, surely Beowulf's Ernerness, or Eagle's Headland in modern English. This was the scene of the final battle. A short distance after that is Grönnäs, formerly Gronäsnäs in old church records. Today it's a golf course, but it fronts onto a hill, and it could well be that Hronesnäs of Beowulf's last resting place, according to another expert on the topic, Gerhard Sager. The poem features a Hrosnaberg, where a battle took place, and Hrafesnäs, where another battle took place, and indeed, some kilometres away there is a Grafnäs today, where there's a 15th century castle located, and also a hill called Rosnaberg. There are no tourist signs showing any of this, but to me, that's pretty strong circumstantial evidence that the real King Hygelac's kingdom, location of the fictional Beowulf's exploits, were around here.
So, and there's an Ernest or Eagleness in Beowulf, isn't there?
Yeah.
Can you tell me where in Beowulf?
This one, Beowulf handles the last battle with it's with the dragon.
And is this called Ernest today?
This place?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right, okay.
It's on the map. If you look onto any internet map,
So within sight.
Shallow bay areas.
And in fact, in the Beowulf poem, they talk about Ernest being on the sea, don't they, or by the water? Is that right?
Yeah.
So it would have fit geographically.
After the clash, he throws the dragon down into the water, so it fits quite well. Yeah.
Okay. And this is a very peaceful place now, and no tourist information and no speculation. So you've got this story to yourself. I mean, you're an archaeologist in truth, can you say? When the dragon is a metaphor for a pagan attack.
Yeah. So it's a demonizing description of a pagan cult.
Beowulf is the English language's most important early poem. Tolkien, the writer and academic, lectured on it to Oxford undergraduates for 30 years, my father among them. In fact, Beowulf was the sole reason why learning a tolerable level of Anglo-Saxon was part of the English degree curriculum. Tolkien had his job set out and he inhabited the Anglo-Saxon language totally. He loved languages, inventing Elvish for Lord of the Rings. With Beowulf so central to his daily work, it's not surprising that his subsequent literary works owed a heavy debt to the poem. The poem's main plot device involved stealing treasures from an evil dragon and was taken wholesale by Tolkien and used in The Hobbit. Of course, it was written by a Christian monk who wanted to pay homage to his ancestors and their worldview at the same time as he was sort of hinting that, well, Christianity was something much better because it wasn't the end of life, but there was eternity of happiness ahead. But the poems and the thinkers and philosophers of the 6th, 7th century, when Europe was becoming de-heathenized, was very much on how to respect your ancestors while projecting onto them the new Christianity. So Beowulf was an example of that. Peter Joftoft's hypothesis is that a heathen West Geatish kingdom of Higelac, near Sweden's western coast, invited some English monks in the 500s. It was the spot in Sweden closest to England, so this was logical. The monks created a bridgehead for Christianity, England having been long since Christianized. The heathens of rival petty kingdoms in West Geatland tried to kill them. Higelac's people, not yet fully Christianized but well disposed to the monks, protected them. But in the end, their strength was too great. Higelac's people suffered a serious defeat and the monks pulled out back to England. Back home, passed down the generations by oral tradition, the doomed Geatish defenders of the English monks were celebrated in verse and song. It eventually was written down and became Beowulf. Beowulf was the invented Superman archetype of Higelac's warriors, while the heathen opposition was written up as a dragon. At the same time, it was a sly piece of propaganda for Christianity. These faithless but immensely courageous pagans who fought each other to the death had only eternal nothingness to look forward to. Christianity was so much better. It offered not nothingness but heaven. The readers and hearers were presumably Christian and knew of the gloomy mental world of their ancestors. So Christianity was held in check in the 500s. It had to wait another 200 or 300 years before it reached Vastergotland again. Again, the missionaries were English, and this time they came to stay. They were more successful than Ansgar's missionary effort in the East Coast, which was traditionally held up by Stockholm and Uppsala historians as the origin of Christianity. A Christian king, Olaf Skötkung, was baptized in Husaby in Västergötland. According to an interpretation by the historian and teacher Otto Löfgren, that baptism in Västergötland was quite a late event in Olaf Skötkung's life. He's in fact baptized and confirmed in England in 994, 10 or 15 years earlier, by the English king Ethelred. In return for promising not to take up the sword against England, he was given Ethelred's best coin martyrs to help him cement his power back in Västergötland. He also borrowed English legal ideas, taxation methods, English titles, the Thane, and English churchmen went with him. We've learnt a lot about Viking rule in England, but this is another story about what went on in the other direction. Västergötland became a bridgehead for the civilizing of the rest of Scandinavia. This is not a story the nationalist historians of Mälardalen want to hear.
Where Olaf didn't trust the people For example, in Bohuslän and Mälardalen and in Östergötland, he also placed tegnar. It shows that Västergötland was a center for Olof's kingdom, and he tried to expand his kingdom to the other parts of what's now in Sweden.
Det unika med detta det är att man också kan se hur Sverige såg ut för 1000 år sedan. Var tyngdpunkten låg och var periferin låg. Och då ser man att då ligger Mälardalen, alltså Uppsala till exempel, ligger ju utanför. Det är alltså absolut inte tyngdpunkten i riket, utan tvärtom så ligger det utanför det här området. Och jag försökte att motbevisa Karl Öving här. Han säger ju att det är tegnar från England. Så jag har gått igenom alla brev som Knut den store skrev. Och alltså tecknat ner alla namn i England på skandinaviska tegnar, som har skandinaviska namn då. Och jämfört dem med runstenarna här. Och det finns alltså inga namn som överensstämmer. Vilket jag tycker visar att det kan inte vara hemvändande engelska tegnar, skandinaviska tegnar, som har kommit hem till Västergötland. Utan det här är tegnar som är härifrån.
Okej, så han har lånat modellen men inte personalen?
Ja.
Eventually in 1015, Sweden's first diocese was founded in Skara, 150 years before a diocese was founded in Uppsala in eastern Sweden. Uppsala was the traditional centre of Swedish ecclesiastical history, and later became the seat of the archbishop. But Skara and Götaland were first. State formation followed the establishment of the church, as a mutually beneficial contract between local kings and the church followed. The kings could benefit from the church's administrative and clerical skills and knowledge of law to expand their domains, while receiving legitimacy from the church's promise of eternal life. The church meanwhile received royal military protection. In tandem, the process expanded outwards and upwards from Vastergotland up towards Stockholm. The county museum in Skara has been telling this story for ages, and 15 kilometres from Skara Cathedral is another impressive church, Varnhem, where nearly all the early kings of Sweden are buried. Knowledge of Varnhem elsewhere in Sweden is limited. It doesn't feature in most school history books, yet Varnhem was the central power nexus of early medieval Sweden. The history of the next 2 centuries is confused and contested. Not an awful lot was written down. Several clans or royal families fought for power. The power bases were in Västergötland and Östergötland respectively. Today's political and economic centre of Sweden, Mälardalen, was marginalised. Stockholm did not exist. In fact, it was founded in 1250 or so by a man who had one of his power bases in Västergötland. His name is Birger Jarl, and Stockholmers revere him as the founder of their city. There's a big catafalque outside the city hall with his name on it, but it's empty. Birger Jarl is not buried there. The Stockholm authorities wanted his body to be relocated from Västergötland about 100 years ago, this place. But the locals said no. Just to check, his body was disinterred, then reinterred in 2002, after his DNA had been tested. Yes, it was indeed him. The fact that this important king was buried here, and not in the city he founded, shows how important Västergötland was back then. But not even in Varnhem is there any sign that Birger Jarl is buried here. You have to go to a history book or ask one of the guides. Very strange. On a hill overlooking this church, archaeologists have excavated the crypt of another church, which has been dated to the 9th century, making it Sweden's oldest church building. It's been linked to English architectural styles, and thousands of coins linked to Ethelred the Unready were found here, establishing a link between England and Västergötland. There's evidence of Christian burial rites, unburnt, uncremated bodies from the late 9th century. That's nearly 300 years before the archbishopric was established in Uppsala in eastern Sweden. Evidence yet again of the power and importance of early Västergötland. However, the excavations were not founded by the Swedish state, but by local companies. I tried to get an interview with the chief archaeologist of the museum in Skara, Maria Vretemark, an extremely competent woman whom everybody said I should talk to. She holds seminars around the country about the excavation work she and her colleagues are engaged in, and a very good job they do. One evening I go along to a seminar at the local museum. I talked to her briefly afterwards, then emailed, but no interview ever materialised. But she did tell me during our informal chat that there were many sites of huge importance that remained unexcavated in the area. In this program from the 1980s, officials admitted that 85% of state funding for archaeology goes to the Stockholm area.
De stora anslagen har till 70-80% gått till forskningsinstitutionerna i Stockholm i första hand och till mindre utsträckning också omkring där. Medan Västsverige har fått 2-3%.
We just have to look at the Viking era and earlier around here, not with the same way as you do in other up in Mälardalen, but just look at for what it is here and go from that. And it's not always people have done that, and that's a problem, I think, anyway. So if you go from that, take what's on the ground in each different area, and you will probably come to some really interesting conclusions. Now and again, I just get the feeling that some of these really old interpretations have been put into our history books, and now we have the possibility and the time to really say, well, we could look over this again and try to figure out what it really is like. And I don't get the idea when I look at things that we have Svealand and they conquer everything else. I got a little bit of a pushback really when I was working up in Stockholm a couple of years ago from some of them, and I realized how infected this was even for them as well. So I got a little bit surprised that it was so infected for them. But this map is also almost like a mental map of the medieval era. And we are then looking between the lakes Vänern and Vättern, and this area in between the lakes, that's where we're situated today. And in the northeast of that area, that's where we are now. This is gold found down here. That's called Barnkälla gold, and that's then much of this gold is probably from the Roman Empire, probably from mines in Romania and Spain to begin with. But it somehow in the 500s it just flows into Sweden, and the majority, 35%, ends up in Skaraborg and in Vastergotland.
This is interesting. This piece of jewellery goes to Stockholm. Does it sit in the National Museum?
Yeah. It's up there. Most of the gold is up there at the moment.
I mean, isn't that a bit unfair that it sits up there and not in the place where it belongs?
It could be annoying, and I find it a bit irritating at times. And it wouldn't be so bad if they just would. It would be easy accessible, but it's a bit tricky to get hold of it.
And then do they inform the viewer where it was based or where it was found?
Usually they do, but now and again, but it's just not very obvious.
And they don't place it into context or tell the bigger story?
The bigger stories around Västergötland is usually never told.
The Museum of National History in Stockholm is the state arbiter of Swedish history. When I was there recently, there's no mention of Västergötland or its sister province Östergötland, the places where Christianity first came to Sweden and where the Swedish state was arguably born. They did not talk about that, but they did talk about fashionable issues which concern the Stockholm cultural elite today, like HBTQ and feminism in contemporary Sweden.
Berätta nu om den här affären med Vikingarnas värld.
Detta var en tv-serie i 3 program som skulle skildra, enligt syftet i alla fall, hur folk levde på vikingatiden. Och det var ett vitt begrepp, vikingatid, de använde från 200-talet till 1350. Och syftet var alltså att skildra hur folk levde, men de skickade in också hur Sveaväldet under den här tidsperioden expanderade från Uppland och söder och västerut. Och därför anmäldes serien, det kom in 6 anmälningar. Och granskningsnämnden för radio och tv tog 11 månader på sig för att fatta ett beslut, vilket är ovanligt lång tid. Och det intressanta är att granskningsnämnden säger att Sveariket expanderade inte från Uppsala, det var inte centrum, och kristnandet skedde inte från Birka. Men man fällde ändå inte serien. Därför att den övergripande kontexten, samhällsstrukturen, låg inte i syftet. Och det innebär alltså att man kan egentligen säga vad som helst i SVT:s program och i fortsättningen. Det är bara det att man gör ett litet syfte och så ser till att den delen är saklig, medan resten kan vara hur osakligt som helst.
Vi har enorma skatter i Västergötland som bara ligger och väntar under jord på att grävas fram. Men vi är bakbundna för att det finns inga ekonomiska medel till det. Vi har stora vikingaskepp som ligger uppe i Vänern och väntar på att grävas ut, som är 20, 22, 24 meter långa, som Mosebergsskeppen och Gokstadsskeppen. Men det finns inga marinarkeologiska medel till det. Arkeologer har vi, men det finns inga pengar. Västergötland är Sveriges mest kyrktätaste område. Åker du här i Västergötland så har du 2, 3, 4 kilometer mellan kyrkorna. Åker du i övriga landet så är det 4-5 mil mellan kyrkorna. Här är så kyrktätt så att man fick till och med riva kyrkor på 12, 13, 1400-talet. Svårarbetat dock för oss som är i den här branschen, det är våra skolor och skolbarn, våra barn och ungdomar. Och det tycker jag är synd, för att det är där egentligen vi måste börja för att skola in våra barn och ungdomar och lära sig av vår västgötska och svenska historia.
Lever Sveaskolan kvar 35 år efter att Dag Storsjö gjorde sin film?
Oh ja.
På vilket sätt?
Ja, alltså senast nu så var det Jonathan Lindström, en arkeolog från Stockholm, som skrev en artikel i Fornvännen. Nej, förlåt. Populär arkeologi. Där han visar Sveastaten, hur den växte fram under årtusenden med fokus på Mälardalen. Sen var det också ett program i Vetenskapens värld i höstas som behandlar Beowulf, och det var en pensionerad arkeolog, Bo Gräslund från Uppsala, som la fram sina teser om vad Sveriges rike låg då, och det är också Mälardalen. Alltså att Beowulfs svear var från Mälardalen och att kungaätten höll till i Uppsala. Så att den lever i största välmåga.
Tolkien was an Edwardian who shared the idea that myths and language were an important part of a nation's soul. But when he came into the field of philology in the early 20th century, he couldn't but help noticing that there was a gap in the mythology of the English people. Other countries had storytellers like the Finn Elias Lönnrot, the Dane Grundtvig, or the German Jacob Grimm. They all had in common the idea that a nation's language was recorded through folklore and sanctioned through literature to the point where they defined the identity of their nations. If traditions were fragmentary or deteriorated, editors had to restore the myths. But Tolkien felt that the English myth appeared completely been destroyed by the Norman invasions, but that they must originally have looked something like the Norse mythology. The stories of the Edda and Beowulf, which is an Anglo-Scandinavian literary product, were good starting points in a literary reconstruction of a purely English mythology. Eventually the purely fantasy element took over in Tolkien's work, but it became Lord of the Rings, which is the most loved book in the English language. Both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings borrowed themes, names, creatures, storylines from both Beowulf and the Edda. And so it's strange that the Swedes have not made more of this, attuned as they are to the culture of the English-speaking world. So much of modern popular culture, like the Game of Thrones or Harry Potter, owes much to Tolkien. There's money to be made if nothing else. At the moment, hardly any tourists come to the neglected corner of Sweden that is Vastergotland. Sections of the mound at Hronesnes in which Beowulf received his final burial has had a railway tunnel driven through it. It's not only ugly and disfiguring, but there's also little interest in exploiting the building site for excavation. Admittedly, Beowulf was not real, but were there not other leading figures of the Higelac Dark Age kingdom buried here? It could give a lot of interesting information. But this is Västergötland, far away from Stockholm, so Stockholm is not interested. Would it be interesting if you got science funding from the Swedish Archaeological Board to pursue digs like this? Or is that out of the question?
Of course, it could be interesting, but I don't think they're not really interested in the poem. It would be better to search for money in England.